Hello, hello.
Hello, and welcome once again to Bible Talk with Bruce and Becky. It's been a bit rainy here in Chattanooga, but it's starting to clear up this evening. We're going to begin in chapter 21 of Genesis as we continue our study through this first book of the Bible. And we're ready this time for the crucial point in the life of Abraham and his family, beginning with the long promised birth of a son. It would be a fulfillment of the promises to bless Abraham and his family with many descendants, to give them the land of Canaan, and to bless all the nations of the earth through this child of promise. Well, the Lord had visited Abraham and Sarah before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, promising in about a year's time they would have a child, even though Sarah was 99 and Abraham 100. Becky, will you please read the first 7 verses of chapter 21?
The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
All right, a time of laughter of various kinds connected with the birth of Isaac. So he is named in Hebrew Yitzhak, or he laughs. We say Isaac in English. This was the son of promise, although Abraham asked God to bless Ishmael. And it may be that up to this point, Abraham and Sarah had believed that Ishmael was the son of promise, but he is not to be that. Ishmael came about because Abraham and Sarah tried to help God out in his promise. It seems to them that it's taking a long time, but God always seems to show up at the right time, not too soon, not too late. And he's not impatient because he knows his plan. Well, verse 8 of Genesis 21, the child grew, that is Isaac, and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. We don't know exactly how old Isaac would have been at this time. It was not unusual for women in that culture to nurse their children for 3 or 4 years anyway. He may have been even older. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son. The son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Once again, we play on the word laughing. Here he may have been just playing with Isaac, or he may have been making mockery of him. But Sarah will have none of it, and she refers to the slave woman. Did Sarah forget, or is she just wanting to deny that it was her idea in the first place for Abraham to take Hagar to have a child?
And this is the second time they've kicked her out, right?
No, she ran away once.
Oh.
Uh, this time she gets kicked out. Verse 11, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. She departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Apparently, she's headed toward her original home of Egypt, wandering in a wilderness area, an uninhabited area. But now things are about to change for her and her son. Becky, would you please begin at verse 15 and read to the end of the chapter?
Okay. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy to drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Haran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. The end of the chapter. At that time, Abimelech said,
Hang on.
Okay.
I thought that was already the end of the chapter.
No.
But we will have another incident involving Abimelech before we get to the key chapter for tonight. So God takes care of Hagar and her son Ishmael, even though Sarah has not been hospitable to them. She's been jealous and angry. This is not a little boy that we're dealing with here. He would have been probably a teenager at this time, but he's still under the care of his mother, and he lives in the wilderness, but there are enough people come into his life that he can become a great nation. Now we go back briefly to a man named Abimelech, or whose title was Abimelech, a ruler of the Philistines. Abraham, go ahead.
You want to mention what great nation came from Ishmael?
Well, there were 12 tribes that came from Ishmael. We would call them the Arabs now, probably. The ancestors of the Muslim peoples today. And in the Quran, they claim that Ishmael was the son of promise, and that it was through him that God brought about a return to the pure religion of Islam. But we won't wander down that path too far. Well, Abraham is still sojourning or living temporarily in the land controlled by Abimelech, and they enter into a treaty here, beginning in chapter 21, verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and the land where you have sojourned." And Abraham said, "I will swear." Well, they get into Abimelech's servants and Abraham's servants in the rest of the chapter, get into a dispute about a well. And Abraham makes a covenant of peace with Abimelech. They sacrifice 7 ewe lambs that will be a witness that he has dug this well. And therefore, verse 31, that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Beersheba, which can mean well of oath or well of seven, gets named and renamed several times in Genesis because of events that take place there. And Abraham plants a tree, which goes into a great tree, and it's a witness to the covenant of peace that he's made with the Philistines and their ruler Abimelech. For the rest of the time that we have today, we're going to focus on chapter 22 of Genesis, one of the pivotal chapters in the Bible. Although Jews and early Christians would not have referred to this as Genesis chapter 22. Why not, Becky? Was it because they read at different numbers for the chapters?
They didn't have any numbers for the chapters.
What? They didn't have chapters and verses?
No.
Well, what did the preachers do if they wanted to refer to it?
They didn't argue as much.
Well, history shows that much later, when Christians began to divide the Bible into chapters and verses, their main motivation for that was so it would be easier to argue. They could debate and say, well, chapter 22, verse 6 says this. But long before there were chapter divisions, there were some chapters so significant, so sections of the Bible so significant that the Jews gave them names. Genesis 22 is one of those. It's been known since ancient times by the Hebrew name Akedah. The Akedah, which is a Hebrew word that means bound or binding.
So this is the agreement.
No, this is the binding of Isaac as a sacrifice.
Oh, gotcha.
We've moved on from that treaty. Isaac will be bound like any other sacrifice. He's going to be offered by his father Abraham, even though he's the son of promise. And many things are tied up in the history of salvation by this chapter. Well, Becky, please read the first 8 verses of chapter 22.
After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took on his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together.
All right.
I think there's a big gap between the verse 2 and verse 3. Because God says, Go to the mountain and offer your son. And the next verse just says, So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Seems to me like there's a whole lot of that story that just didn't get told.
Oh, and why do you say that?
Well, what do you do when somebody says, Go take your son and kill him? You know.
If you're Abraham, you do exactly what God has said as soon as you're able to. One of the things we learn from this chapter is Abraham's growth in faith and being willing to trust what the Lord says. The New Testament says he didn't waver in his faith when God told him to offer his son. And Paul says in Romans he believed that God could raise the dead. He has learned that if God, whatever God says, however improbable it sounds, is what he should do. So Abraham becomes known as the father of the faithful. I'm sure there was some inner turmoil going on with him somehow, but I think there is a gap there. I think he got up early the next morning and set out. Notice that Isaac is described as your son, your only son, whom you love. Was Isaac Abraham's only son? No. Remember Ishmael. Some early translations in English refer to him as the only begotten son, but he was not the only begotten son either. Perhaps it could be translated your unique son, your one of a kind son, the son of the promise. I point that out because this kind of language is also used about Jesus. Jesus was God's only son in a special sense, the son of promise that all this is leading up to. And many things in this chapter make us think of Jesus as Christians looking back on it. Your only son, the son that you've been waiting for all these years, your son of the promise, your one of a kind son, whom you love, take him an offering as a sacrifice. I started to say these things remind us of Jesus and his sacrifice. Can they remind us of Jesus if he hasn't come along yet? If it'll be 2,000 years until he gets here? I heard it said or read it somewhere that we tend to think that the history of salvation is flowing from the present into the future. But really, biblically speaking, the story of salvation is flowing from the future into the present.
Because it's going to be when all the saints get to heaven, I guess.
Well, and when Jesus comes to fulfill the real promise, that these are just a glimpse of, when Jesus is bound and carries the wood to the place of sacrifice, as Isaac does, and although he is God's unique son, the one he loves, God will offer him up as a sacrifice. But Abraham can rejoice that God does not make him kill his son. I'll begin reading in verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Notice that Isaac is old enough to discuss with his father what's missing from this sacrificial altar. Where is the lamb that we should be offering? Pop quiz here. How old was Isaac at this point? I asked the question, you get to answer.
Well, how do we know?
We don't.
That's what I figured.
But the Jews thought they did, at least some of them. Ancient Jewish tradition says that Isaac was 37 years old at this time.
What?
They come up with that by figuring how old Sarah was when Isaac was born. How old was she?
She was 99.
No, Abraham was 99.
Somebody was 100.
Abraham.
Yeah.
She was 90. She was 10 years younger.
Oh, okay.
How old was Sarah when she died?
100 and something.
127.
Okay.
They figured that Sarah died shortly after this, and so subtracting 90 from 127, they get 37 years for the age of Isaac. Probably not, but he was at least a teenager. And he's called a lad, which could be anybody up to 30 years old. So he also is submissive to God's will here and to his father's. He's old enough to know what's going on, but he allows himself to be bound because his father uh, asked him to. And Abraham has said, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. What a dramatic moment as the knife is raised in Abraham's hand. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Yes, here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh.
God provides.
The Lord will provide. As it is said, to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. To this day, the time of the writer, much after the time of Abraham, maybe 600 to 800 years after the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And notice it refers to the mount of Yahweh, the mount of the Lord. Where is this that Abraham has gone to in later history? Do we know? Well, we do know. It becomes known later as the threshing floor of Arana. And David buys this threshing floor from Arana. And what is later constructed at that place on that hill?
The temple?
The temple.
The temple.
Although Solomon actually builds the temple. And not far from the temple, a great sacrifice was made. Ooh, there's a hummingbird.
My first.
Our first hummingbird, our new feeder. Pardon the interruption. We're looking outside. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. What shall be provided?
A sacrifice.
The sacrifice that Abraham didn't have to make, but that God is willing to make for our salvation. This angel of the Lord appears here again, who is a representative of God and at times speaks as God himself, probably because that's what ambassadors or representatives of a king would do in those days. They would quote the king's words, the king that they represented, as if they were their own. But let's read the rest of the chapter, and then we'll quit for now. Becky, please read 15 through the end of the chapter.
And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Fildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel.
Of course.
Bethuel fathered Rebekah. Well, that's a good one. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tehbah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah.
Good job. We wrap up that great chapter with a bit of genealogy to kind of close one portion of Abraham's family before we say goodbye to Abraham in the near future. Well, a great chapter. We'll call it the Akedah, as the Jews have. I meant to mention when I was talking about the fact that they gave titles to these sections of Scripture. A story that takes place in the Gospels, where Jesus is in a discussion with the Sadducees about life after death, and he says to them, "Have you not read in the bush?" That's usually translated something like the section about the bush. But another prominent section from the book of Exodus about Moses at the burning bush, instead of quoting a chapter, the Jews would say, remember the bush, where it says, remember the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And so they had ways of remembering and finding these sections of Scripture.
It's kind of like we talk about the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
And the Transfiguration. And
yes.
Such.
And such. Well, a great story of a great sacrifice, one that didn't have to be made, and one that did. The center of the whole Bible, Old and New Testament, is Jesus, his death, burial, and resurrection. Well, we'll move on and close out the story of Abraham in the near future and get to the final section of Genesis, which is my personal favorite, the story of Joseph. But until then, may God bless you, and remember our motto, don't send money. Bye-bye.